The most powerful man in Chicago, a name that made the whole city tremble, though no one had ever seen his face, was standing at a sink washing dishes in a rundown diner on the South Side, wearing a worn-out shirt, with a few coins in his pocket. One phone call from him could move the entire city, yet night after night he lay awake with a question no one could answer. If I had no money and no power, would anyone still love me? So he did what no boss had ever dared to do. He walked away from everything and became a penniless, unemployed mechanic, only to taste what he had never known in his life: being looked down on, being laughed at, being turned away by the most beautiful women in the neighborhood, as if he were a beggar. But just as he was about to give up, a poor waitress, a woman the whole neighborhood had turned its back on for a sin she never committed, stopped beside him with a cup of hot coffee and a few words that cracked his frozen heart. No one in that neighborhood could have imagined that the dishwasher they mocked every day would leave them all speechless at exactly 5 o'clock that afternoon, when 3 black cars pulled up in front of the diner, and the truth came to light. Stay with this story until the very end, because that moment will show you one thing. Eyes can be fooled by appearances, but a sincere heart never can. If you believe that kindness is always rewarded, please hit the like button and share this story with the people you love. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next touching story. Now, let the story begin. 6 months before the day 3 black cars pulled up in front of that diner, Everett Kane was still sitting in a windowless conference room, buried deep beneath the basement of a building in the Gold Coast, where the only light came from a low-hanging lamp suspended over the table, bright enough to reveal the face of every person seated around it except one. That man sat at the far end of the table. Inside a pocket of darkness, the lamp had been deliberately positioned not to reach, and for 2 full hours, no one dared look directly toward him. It was the first rule of the Kane family, a rule that had existed since his father was still alive. No one was allowed to see the boss's face. No photographs, no newspapers, no cameras, no trace of him beyond the name. All of Chicago knew the name Kane. The police knew it, the other gangs knew it, and the most powerful politicians in the city knew it too. Yet not one of them could have told you what Everett Kane looked like. People called him the ghost of Chicago, and a ghost didn't need a face. A ghost only needed to be feared. Every order he gave passed through one man and one man alone: Frankie Moss, a 40-year-old man with steady eyes and a loyalty that had been tested for 20 years, ever since the days when he served Everett's father. That night, when the meeting ended, Frankie rose and delivered the boss's final decision concerning the Southern Port District, his voice even and measured, without a single wasted word, and the men around the table could do nothing but lower their heads. No one objected. In this city, a man could bargain with the police, he could buy a judge, but no one bargained with the name Kane. And yet the very name that made an entire city bow carried principles that many men in their world couldn't understand. Don't touch civilians. Don't take a single cent from the poor. Don't betray those who remain loyal. His father had once told him that power without principle was nothing more than the savagery of a beast, and Everett had carved every one of those words into the way he governed his empire for the past 8 years, ever since the old man was laid to rest. Only after everyone had left did Everett step out of the darkness and walk alone down the long corridor toward his private elevator. Frankie was already waiting. He quietly said that everything had been handled, and Everett merely nodded. That was the entire conversation between the 2 most powerful men in Chicago that night. The elevator carried him to the highest floor, where a vast penthouse looked down over the whole city, glittering beneath his feet. Everett stood for a long time before the enormous wall of glass, holding a glass of liquor he hadn't taken a single sip from. At 34, he possessed the things most people could sacrifice an entire lifetime and still never obtain: more money than he needed to count, enough power that he didn't have to raise his voice, and the fearful respect of an entire city. But every night, when the apartment door closed behind him, all those things remained outside, and the only thing that followed him in was silence. The penthouse had 12 rooms and not a single human voice. The dining table was long enough to seat 20 guests, yet no one had ever shared a meal with him there. His phone held hundreds of contacts, and suddenly he realized something that made even him stop. Among all those hundreds of names, there wasn't one person he could call without it being about business. Not one person ever called simply to ask whether he'd eaten dinner. Not one. People feared the name Kane. People needed the name Kane. People humbled themselves before the name Kane. But no one had ever loved the man standing behind it. He remembered the time Frankie had asked whether the boss ever felt tired, and Everett had answered that a man standing at the top wasn't allowed to be tired. But that had been the answer of the name Kane, not Everett. Everett was tired. Tired in a way money couldn't buy away with a good night's sleep, in a way power couldn't trade for a meal filled with laughter. He set the untouched glass down, and at that exact moment, the phone inside his coat pocket began to vibrate. Very few people had that number, and no one called at this hour unless something had happened. He looked at the screen. It was the number of Northwestern Hospital, where his mother was receiving treatment. His heart seemed to slow for a single beat. The only woman in the world who loved him without caring how powerful he was, the only person who called him Everett instead of Mr. Kane, was lying in that hospital with a heart that grew weaker by the day. He answered, and the voice of the night nurse came through, respectful but urgent. "Sir." Teresa took a turn for the worse tonight. "The doctor says her condition is stable for now, but she keeps asking for you. Perhaps you should come." Everett said nothing except, "I'm coming." He put on his coat and walked toward the door. And for the first time in many years, the most powerful man in Chicago felt afraid. Not afraid of bullets, not afraid of betrayal, but afraid of something far simpler. Afraid that he would lose the only person in this world who truly loved him before he had the chance to show her the one thing she had longed to see most. The black car moved through the empty streets close to midnight, and throughout the entire drive to Northwestern Hospital, Everett didn't say a word. He went straight to the 7th floor through the private entrance the hospital reserved for special patients, where his mother lay in the quietest room. And when he pushed open the door and stepped inside, Teresa was resting against her pillows, her face pale, but her eyes brightened the moment she saw her son. She reached one hand toward him, a thin hand marked by blue veins, and he took it between both of his, sitting on the edge of the bed like a child. Outside in the hallway, the doctor had told him that her heart was like a machine that had been running for too long. There was no immediate crisis, but the time she had left was no longer measured in years, and the best anyone could do was keep her peaceful. Teresa studied her son for a long moment, then smiled faintly and told him not to look at her that way. She wasn't going anywhere. She was only a little tired. Everett tried to keep his voice calm as he said she would get better, that he would bring the finest doctors in America to see her. But she shook her head, slowly and gently, and said, "Everett, your money can cure many things, but it can't cure old age, and I'm not afraid of that. There's only one thing I'm afraid of." He asked what she feared, and she remained silent for a long time before answering. "I'm afraid that when I close my eyes for the last time, you'll be sitting alone in that enormous house, with no one to pour you a cup of tea, and no one waiting for you to come home. I don't need a daughter-in-law from the right family. I don't need some young lady from a distinguished name. Before I close my eyes, I only need to see that there's someone who loves you, who loves my Everett, not the Kane name." The room fell silent after those words, with only the steady beeping of the heart monitor remaining, and Everett lowered his eyes to his mother's hand inside his own, because he knew better than anyone why her words cut like a blade. 7 years earlier, he had once believed he'd found such a person. He didn't want to speak her name anymore. He only remembered that she was beautiful, intelligent, and knew how to say the kinds of things that could make a man believe he was loved. They became engaged. He brought her home to meet his mother. He allowed her into the part of his life he'd never opened to anyone. Then one night, he came home earlier than expected and heard her speaking to a friend on the phone out on the balcony, her voice bright and musical as she said, "What do you think I love about him? I love the Kane name. I love those black cards with no limit. The man himself is as cold as a wall. Who could ever love someone like that? I'll endure it for a few years, and then I'll have everything." Everett stood behind that glass door for a long time. He didn't step outside. He didn't lose his temper. He simply turned away in silence, and the next morning, she received a letter and a one-way plane ticket out of Chicago. There was no scene, no revenge, only a heart that froze from that night forward, and a promise he made to himself that he would never let another woman come close to him again. Yet now, sitting beside his mother's hospital bed and hearing her final wish, that promise had suddenly become a prison. He kissed her forehead and told her to rest. "I promise you, Mother, I'll find that person." She smiled and closed her eyes, and he remained there until she had fallen deeply asleep before leaving the room. The hospital corridor outside was empty and quiet. Frankie was waiting with 2 cups of hot coffee, and for the first time in many years, Everett told him everything. He told him about his mother's wish, about the fear that every woman who came near him saw only the Kane name, about the question that clung to him night after night, asking whether anyone would still choose to stay if he had nothing at all. Frankie listened to every word without interrupting, then remained thoughtful for a long time before speaking. "Boss, I've served this family for 20 years. I've never dared advise you about anything outside of business, but today I'm asking you to let me say this once. Your problem isn't that sincere people don't exist. Your problem is that, as long as you stand beneath the light of the Kane name, you'll never be able to tell who has come for you and who has come for the light. Then take off the Kane name, leave the Gold Coast, go somewhere no one knows you, live like a man with empty hands and nothing in his pockets. There, whoever looks down on you will show you their true heart. Whoever comes to you when you have nothing, that person is real." Everett looked at his only friend for a long time, and something slowly began to glow in his eyes. A light that had been extinguished for 7 years. Over the days that followed, everything was arranged in absolute silence. Frankie would temporarily oversee the family business in his name. To the outside world, nothing would change, because every order had always passed through Frankie's mouth anyway. No one needed to see the boss to believe the boss was still there. The two men agreed to communicate only through an old phone that couldn't be traced, and only when it was truly necessary. Once every 2 weeks, at midnight, a car would pick Everett up at a predetermined street corner, take him back to visit his mother, then return him before dawn. No one could know, not even the family's own men. On his final night in the penthouse, Everett stood before the large mirror in his dressing room. He removed the watch from his wrist, a watch worth as much as an entire house. He slipped off the ring his father had left him. He took off the suit that had been made for him in Milan, and dressed instead in an old shirt, worn thin at the shoulders, and a pair of work pants Frankie had bought from a second-hand store. The man in the mirror looked unfamiliar, yet somehow more real than ever before. From that moment on, Everett Kane no longer existed. There was only Reese Cole, 34 years old, an unemployed mechanic from Detroit who had drifted into Chicago looking for work, with a few coins in his pocket and a faded backpack over one shoulder. He studied that man in the mirror for a long time, then quietly said to himself, "Let's go find the answer." The old bus dropped Reese Cole off on the south side on an early autumn morning, and from the very first step he took, he understood that he had entered an entirely different world. There were no gleaming glass towers, no doormen bowing in greeting, only rows of aging red brick buildings with peeling paint, small shops beneath faded signs, and people hurrying past with faces deeply marked by worry. He rented a room on the 3rd floor of a worn old building, a space barely large enough for an iron bed, a crooked wooden table, and a single window overlooking the alley behind it. The rent was paid by the week, and the building manager took his money without even bothering to ask his name. On that first night, lying on a squeaking spring mattress, the man who had once slept in a penthouse overlooking all of Chicago listened to car horns drifting up from the street below and the voices of some married couple arguing through the thin wall, and strangely enough, he wasn't disturbed. He only felt that everything around him was real, painfully and nakedly real. The next morning, he began looking for work. He had planned his disguise carefully. An unemployed mechanic from Detroit was a believable story, and he knew enough about machinery to keep anyone from discovering the truth. But he quickly learned that in this neighborhood, knowing how to work wasn't enough. The owner of the first repair shop looked him up and down, then asked where his old employment records were, where his letters of recommendation were, where the telephone number of his former employer was, and when Reese said he had none of those things, the man waved him away like a fly and didn't bother listening to another word. The second shop was the same, then the third, then a warehouse, then a gas station. Everywhere he went, the same scene repeated itself. People looked at his worn clothes, looked at the emptiness of his history, and in their eyes he read a single word: suspicion. One man even told him directly that no one these days would risk hiring someone with no clear background. For all he knew, Reese might have just gotten out of prison. 6 months earlier, Everett Kane only had to lift one finger, and 1,000 men would have lined up for the privilege of serving him. Now Reese Cole stood on a cracked sidewalk, after being turned away for the 10th time in 3 days, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be looked down upon, a feeling no book and no report had ever taught him. The strange thing was that he didn't feel angry. He felt only a dim, aching sorrow. because he suddenly thought of the thousands of people in this neighborhood who had spent their entire lives beneath that same gaze, with no empire waiting for them to return to. By the fourth day, only a few coins remained in his pocket. He walked along the neighborhood's main street as the afternoon slowly faded, and when he passed a small courtyard in front of a row of houses, he saw a group of children playing soccer with a dented plastic ball. Their laughter rang out clear and bright through the gray streets. One child kicked the ball into the base of a tree, and the whole group collapsed, laughing, clutching their stomachs with the innocent delight of people who believed there was nothing in the world worth worrying about. Reese stood watching for a while, and the corner of his mouth lifted before he realized it, his first smile since arriving there. Even in a place that seemed to have nothing left, joy could still grow, simple and stubborn as weeds. But a smile couldn't fill an empty stomach, and the hunger that had followed him since noon was beginning to twist inside him. He stopped in front of a small diner on the corner. The wooden sign painted with the words Dottie's Diner had faded with time, but the glass windows were spotless, and warm golden light spilled out from inside. He pushed open the door, the little bell above it chimed, and the smell of toasted bread and coffee rushed over him, making his stomach tighten. He chose the smallest table in the corner, picked up the menu, and did something Everett Kane had never done once in his entire life. He read the prices before he read the names of the food. He reached into his pocket, placed the loose coins on the table, counted them one by one in silence, then ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a plate of French fries and a glass of water. He didn't know that from behind the register, a silver-haired woman of about 60 wearing a checkered apron had seen everything. She saw the way he counted every coin. She saw the way he folded the menu as though he were a man who had just lost a wager against life itself. She said nothing. She only turned toward the waitress carrying a tray and quietly gave her an instruction. A few minutes later, the waitress came to his table and set down the plate of French fries he had ordered, then added a steaming hamburger and a cup of hot coffee. Reese looked up and quickly said, "Miss, I didn't order these. I don't have enough money to pay for them." The waitress smiled. There was something tired at the edges of her eyes, yet the smile itself carried a strange warmth, and she told him he didn't have to pay. The diner was giving them to him. The owner said the kitchen had made one serving too many that day, and it would be a waste to throw it away. He looked at her, a young woman of about 27, with her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, hands marked by the calluses of someone accustomed to hard work, and a small name tag pinned to her uniform bearing a single word, Maggie. He thanked her, his voice softer than he had intended, and she only nodded before turning away to carry more trays, moving with the quick steps of someone who couldn't afford to stand still. He ate slowly, and for reasons he couldn't understand, that simple hamburger made his throat tighten. Perhaps it was because, in all his 34 years, this was the first time anyone had given him something without knowing who he was, and without expecting anything in return. When the diner had nearly emptied, the silver-haired woman came to his table, pulled out the chair across from him, and sat down. She studied him with eyes that were sharp, but not unkind, then asked directly whether he was new to the neighborhood and looking for work. She said she could tell by the way he counted his money. He nodded and admitted that he was. He told her his name was Reese, that he was a mechanic from Detroit, and that he had spent 4 days looking for work without finding anyone willing to hire him. She examined him for another moment, as though weighing the value of something placed before her, then said, "I'm Dottie. I own this diner. My dishwasher quit last week. The pay isn't high and the work is hard, but lunch and dinner are included. Can you do it?" Reese looked at her and answered, "Yes, I can," so quickly that even he was surprised. Dottie stood, wiped her hands against her apron, and before returning to the kitchen, she glanced back at him, narrowed her eyes, and added one final sentence that sounded partly like a warning and partly like pity. "Listen, son, I'll tell you this now. Being gentle and decent is a good thing, but don't let yourself dream too much around here. The women in this neighborhood are practical. When you're as poor as you are, they won't even bother answering when you say hello." Reese only smiled and said nothing. But inside him, her words echoed like a challenge fate had just placed on the table, because that was exactly the answer he had come here to find. The dishwashing job at Dottie's Diner began early in the morning and ended long after darkness had settled over the streets. The hands that had once done nothing more strenuous than sign documents and hold a glass of wine were now submerged in hot water and soap for 10 hours every day, the skin turning red and raw before slowly hardening into calluses. But Reese never complained once. He worked neatly and thoroughly, Arrived early, stayed late, and after only 1 week, Dottie had to admit to herself that she had never hired anyone so hardworking. Yet while the work treated him fairly, the people in that neighborhood treated him with equal harshness. One afternoon, when he was allowed to leave early, he carried his clothes to the laundromat at the end of the street, and while he sat waiting, he noticed several young women standing nearby talking. He nodded politely and tried to begin a conversation, asking nothing more than a casual question about the weather and the neighborhood, the way neighbors usually became acquainted. But the women turned and looked at him, their eyes moving from his old shoes with the worn heels to the shirt frayed at the shoulders. Then they exchanged glances. No one answered. One of them curled her lip slightly, and the entire group picked up their laundry baskets and moved to the opposite corner of the laundromat. Their quiet laughter drifted back clearly enough that he didn't need to wonder who they were laughing at. Reese remained seated alone beside the turning washing machine, remembering Dottie's warning on his first day, and realizing she hadn't exaggerated at all. But the real blow was still waiting for him. In that part of the South Side, there was one woman who drew the eyes of every man wherever she went. Her name was Kendra Vaughn. She was 28 years old and worked as a receptionist at a spa on the main street. Her face was strikingly beautiful, and her clothes were always far more polished than her salary should have allowed. Kendra was beautiful, and Kendra knew exactly how beautiful she was. She regarded that beauty as her only ticket out of the poor neighborhood, and she made no effort to hide it from anyone. The men around her were nothing more than entertainment, while she waited for some expensive car to stop and carry her away. Reese had seen her pass the diner several times with the bearing of a queen walking among her subjects, and he had no interest in her until the final Saturday evening of the month, when the whole neighborhood held its annual fundraising dance in the church hall to raise money for repairs to the roof of the old school. Dottie closed the diner early and told him he should go and see it for himself. People in the neighborhood could be cruel, she said, but that evening was one of the rare occasions when everyone treated one another kindly. Reese went and stood quietly in one corner of the hall, which had been decorated with strings of warm golden lights, watching elderly husbands and wives guide each other gently across the floor to old familiar songs. For one brief moment, he forgot who he was. He forgot the experiment entirely. He only felt his heart soften before a simple warmth he had never been allowed to stand within during his entire life. Then he saw Kendra, impossible to miss in the middle of the crowd in a red dress, standing with her friends near the refreshment table, and an idea came to him. It wasn't because he felt any attraction toward her. He simply wanted to know. He wanted to test the very question that had brought him to that neighborhood, to see how a man with nothing in his hands would be treated. He straightened the collar of his old shirt, crossed the dance floor, stopped in front of Kendra, and with all the courtesy of a man who had been raised properly, he inclined his head, extended one hand, and said, "Hello, my name is Reese. I work at Dottie's diner. I was wondering whether I might have the honor of asking you to dance." The music continued, yet that entire corner of the hall seemed to fall silent. Kendra turned and stared at his outstretched hand, as though she were looking at something filthy. Then her gaze traveled over him from head to toe, slowly and deliberately, before she burst into laughter, a bright, sharp sound like breaking glass. Loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, she said, "Who did you say you were? The dishwasher from Dottie's diner? My God, have you looked in a mirror? A dishwasher asking me to dance? Do you have any idea how much the shoes I'm wearing cost? You could wash dishes your entire life and still never afford them." Her friends erupted in laughter. Scattered laughter rose from other parts of the hall as well. Some people turned completely around to get a better look at the man who had just been humiliated, and Reese stood there in the center of that circle of laughter as his outstretched hand slowly lowered. The man standing silently in the middle of the hall needed only to take the old phone from his pocket and dial a single number, and before midnight, the spa where she worked would have a new owner, the building where she lived would have a new owner, and the entire street could have a new owner if he wished it. But no one in that hall knew any of it. They saw only a poor dishwasher standing frozen after being humiliated, and they laughed. Reese looked at Kendra for a moment, his expression so strangely calm that the smile on her lips faltered slightly, though she couldn't have explained why. Then he gave a small nod and said, "I'm sorry to have bothered you. I hope you enjoy your evening." He turned and walked away from the crowd, his back straight, his steps even, never quickening by so much as a single beat. He passed the reception table for the fundraiser, where a gray-haired man of about 60 stood recording the accounts in a ledger. He wore an old suit, but it was carefully pressed, and everyone in the neighborhood addressed him respectfully as Mr. Pratt. He was the chairman of the neighborhood council and had organized that fundraiser just as he had done for many years. Gordon Pratt looked up precisely as Reese walked past, and his eyes settled on him. It wasn't the mocking stare of the others. It was cold, careful, and searching, the look of a man weighing a possible threat. He followed Reese with his eyes all the way to the door, then turned to the person beside him and quietly asked who the man was, where he had come from, and how long he had been in the neighborhood. Someone answered that he was only the new dishwasher at Dottie's diner, no one worth worrying about, but Gordon Pratt didn't join in the laughter. He tapped one finger lightly against the ledger, his eyes still fixed on the door that had closed behind Reese, and murmured something only he could hear, that he didn't like strangers with unknown pasts in his neighborhood. He didn't like them at all. Reese, meanwhile, walked alone through the night streets toward his rented room, the autumn wind slipping through his thin shirt, and he thought about Kendra's laughter and the eyes of everyone in that hall. His heart didn't ache because he had been humiliated. It ached because another question had been growing larger with every day he spent in that neighborhood. If this was how people treated a human being simply because he was poor, then how many hearts in this world had been judged wrongly because of nothing more than the clothes they wore? What happened at the dance that night took exactly one day to spread across the South Side, because in poor neighborhoods, rumor was the only thing that traveled faster than the wind. People retold the story in every possible version. Some said the dishwasher from Dottie's diner had dared grab Kendra by the hand and drag her onto the dance floor. Others swore he had made shameless advances toward her, and by the end of the week, the whole neighborhood had given him the same name: the delusional dishwasher, the penniless fool who had dared dream of reaching for the most beautiful flower in the neighborhood. The diner's regular customers began looking at him differently. Some mocked him openly, calling him over to bring water, then asking with sly smiles whether he planned to invite another woman to dance that day. One housewife pulled her child away when he passed, as though his poverty were some contagious disease. Reese accepted all of it in silence. He continued washing dishes, wiping tables, and nodding politely to the very people who had ridiculed him. Only Maggie, the waitress with the tired smile, would sometimes look at him with a quiet expression that wasn't pity, but something more like one person recognizing herself in another, even though the two of them still hadn't spoken beyond the brief exchanges required by their work. But the trouble didn't end with gossip. One afternoon early that week, Gordon Pratt's old but carefully polished car stopped in front of the diner, and the chairman of the neighborhood council stepped inside, wearing the respectable smile that always seemed fixed upon his face. He chose a table near the counter, ordered a cup of coffee, and asked Dottie about her health and the diner. All the polite questions he had repeated 1,000 times to 1,000 people in the neighborhood. Then, when the diner had emptied, he lowered his voice, leaned forward, and said, "Dottie, the truth is, I came here today because there's something I think you should consider. I'm only speaking plainly because we've known each other for years. What do you really know about that dishwasher you just hired? No papers, no background, no one who knows him. He simply drifted into our neighborhood from nowhere. These are difficult times. This neighborhood has remained peaceful because we've always been careful. My advice is to let him go sooner rather than later, before he brings trouble upon you and drags the rest of us into it." Dottie listened without pausing as she polished a glass in her hand. Then she set it down, looked Gordon Pratt directly in the eyes, and said, "Mr. Pratt, I've run this diner for 30 years. I judge people by the way they work and the way they treat others, not by the papers they carry. Reese arrives before anyone else and leaves after everyone else. He hasn't taken a cent from me beyond the wages he earned. He hasn't spoken harshly to a single person. And as for where he came from, 30 years ago, when I drifted into this neighborhood and opened this diner, I had nothing but my own 2 empty hands. Had everyone thought the way you do, there wouldn't be a diner here today for you to sit in and drink your coffee." Gordon Pratt's face tightened for a second. Then he laughed lightly and said, "Well, it's your choice. I was only trying to warn you. Don't say I didn't tell you." He placed the money for his coffee on the table and walked out with the same dignified stride he had worn when he entered. But through the narrow opening of the kitchen door, Reese had heard everything. What caught his attention wasn't the slander itself, but a small question that began stirring in his mind. Why would a stranger like him, a dishwasher supposedly too insignificant to matter, as Pratt himself had said at the dance, trouble the chairman enough to make him drive all the way there in person? That night, rain began to fall, the first cold, lingering rain of autumn. The diner closed late because the storeroom had to be cleaned, and when everything was finally finished, Reese sat alone on the back steps beneath the corrugated metal awning, listening to the rain strike it in a steady rhythm. More than a month had passed since he arrived on the south side, and that night, for the first time, the feeling of failure seeped into him colder than the damp air. He thought about the sidelong glances at the laundromat, Kendra's laughter in the middle of the hall, the whispers behind his back, and Gordon Pratt's undisguised suspicion. A bitter thought slowly crawled into his mind. Perhaps Frankie had been right about the method, but wrong about the result. Perhaps the answer to Everett's question was simpler and crueler than he had imagined. Perhaps there was no one. Perhaps when a man had nothing left in his hands, all the world gave him were closed doors and laughter behind his back. He took the old phone from his coat pocket, the phone that held only one number. His thumb rested over the call button. One brief call, one sentence telling them to come get him. And before sunrise he would be Everett Kane again. He would have everything again, and he would never have to hear another mocking laugh. His thumb touched the button lightly, then stopped, because the diner's back door suddenly opened. Dottie stepped outside carrying 2 cups of hot tea. She didn't ask him anything. She simply sat beside him on the step, handed him 1 cup, and the two of them listened to the rain for a long while. Then she spoke slowly, her eyes still fixed upon the curtain of water beyond the awning. "Reese, I'm an old woman now, and I'm rarely wrong about people. You're not from this neighborhood, and you're no mechanic either. During your first week, your hands blistered from the hot water. No real mechanic's hands would do that. But I haven't asked, because everyone has something in their life they need to keep hidden. All I know is that you're searching for something. I don't know what you came to this neighborhood to find, but son, let me tell you what 30 years behind a stove have taught me. The things worth finding never come quickly. The best stew is the one that cooks the longest. Turn off the flame now, and everything you've done will have been wasted. And who knows, perhaps it only needs one more night before it finally becomes tender." Reese turned to look at the silver-haired woman beside him as she gently blew across the surface of her tea, and in that moment, in the middle of a neighborhood that had shown him every shade of contempt, he remembered that people like her still existed, and people like the waitress who had brought him the free hamburger on his first day, small flames that kept burning even in the rain. He quietly slipped the phone back into the inside pocket of his coat, finished his tea, and told her, "Thank you, I'll stay." A few days later, the diner began receiving late-night delivery orders from workers finishing their shifts at a factory near the lake, and Reese took on the job. Every night, he rode the diner's old bicycle out with the food and returned when the streets had gone completely still. That particular night, after completing his final delivery, he didn't ride directly back to his room. He stopped along a deserted stretch of the waterfront overlooking Lake Michigan, sat down on a stone bench, and stared across the dark water where the distant city lights trembled upon the surface. It was the same city he had once held in his hands, and now he stood at its farthest edge. He remained there, not knowing how much time had passed, until a voice rose softly behind him, so quiet it nearly disappeared into the sound of the waves, and the warmth of a cup of hot coffee was offered over his shoulder. The voice said, "It's very cold tonight. Drink this. It's on me." Reese turned around and saw Maggie standing there, still wearing her diner uniform beneath a thin coat, one hand extended toward him with a steaming paper cup of coffee, and she said that the night shift had given her a cup, but she had already drunk one, and it would be a waste to throw this one away, so he shouldn't feel awkward about taking it. He accepted the coffee, the warmth spreading through his frozen palm, and asked why she was still out on the street at this hour. She said she had just finished her second job, that she worked an additional night shift cleaning at the factory nearby, that she walked home along this stretch of the lakeshore every day, and that for the past several nights, she had seen him sitting there alone. She hesitated for a moment, then sat down at the other end of the stone bench, leaving a distance between them that was politely measured. The two of them silently watched the lake for a while, and then she spoke, her voice so soft that it seemed she was speaking to the water rather than to him. She said that she had heard about what happened at the dance. Everyone in the neighborhood had heard. She wasn't there to comfort him. She only wanted to say one thing, that she knew what it felt like to have an entire neighborhood look at you as though you didn't deserve to exist. She knew that feeling very well, better than anyone else in that part of the city. Reese turned to look at her, and beneath the pale yellow streetlight, he saw no pity on her face, the kind of pity he had grown tired of, and no curiosity of the kind he had learned to guard against. There was only an old weariness and the understanding that a person could possess only after walking through such pain herself. Very quietly, he asked why she knew that feeling. Maggie remained silent for a long time, her hands clasped together in her lap. And then she began to tell him, in the steady voice of someone who had repeated the story to herself 1,000 times in her mind, but had never told it completely to anyone. She said that 12 years earlier, when she was 15, her father had been the treasurer of the neighborhood church. He did the work without pay because he believed in God and believed in people. Everyone in the neighborhood respected him and called him kind Mr. Rowe, until the day they discovered that nearly all the church building fund had disappeared. Money the entire neighborhood had spent 3 years collecting to repair the dome and open free classes for children in need. The account books were in disorder, and every trace pointed to one person, her father, the man who held the key to the safe and kept the records. She said that her father swore before the cross that he hadn't taken a single cent, that there were expenses he had never approved, even though the documents carried a signature exactly like his, and that he begged everyone to give him time to uncover the truth. But no one gave him time. People needed someone to blame, and his name was the most convenient one. She told Reese that the man who organized the neighborhood meetings to judge her father, the man who read every missing amount aloud before the crowd, the man who spoke the sentence she still remembered to that day, that they had raised a snake in their own home, was Gordon Pratt. At the time, he had been vice chairman of the neighborhood council, and it was that very scandal that allowed him to rise as the supposed defender of the neighborhood's integrity and take the chairman's seat a few years later. At the sound of that name, the cup in Reese's hand stopped halfway to his lips, but he said nothing and continued listening. Maggie explained that the police investigated but couldn't find enough evidence for a criminal conviction, so there was no sentence. But in neighborhoods like theirs, the court of public judgment was far more merciless than any real courtroom. The church removed her father from every position. The neighbors stopped greeting him. Children were forbidden to play with her. The name kind Mr. Rowe was replaced by thief, and from the age of 15, wherever she went, whispers followed behind her, saying that she was the thief's daughter. She said her father grew thinner with each passing day. He aged 10 years in the space of one. He kept telling Maggie and her mother that heaven had eyes, and that the truth would one day come into the light, but the truth didn't come soon enough. 2 years later, he died of a heart attack in the middle of the night, and Maggie still believed that what killed him wasn't a weak heart, but the weight of an injustice he had never been able to clear from his name. Her voice tightened as she reached that part of the story, but she didn't cry. She continued, saying that after the funeral, her mother collapsed beneath the grief and gradually became seriously ill. For the past several years, she had been confined to bed, and Maggie worked 2 shifts every day, mornings at Dottie's diner and nights at the factory, to pay the hospital bills and the cost of medicine. She was 27 years old, and she couldn't remember the last time she had slept through an entire night. She turned toward him, and for the first time during the whole story, the corner of her mouth lifted into a sad smile. She said, "That's why, Reese, when everyone in this neighborhood laughed at you because you were poor, I didn't laugh. I know how terribly wrong people can be about another human being. This entire neighborhood was wrong about my father. They looked at the account books and refused to look at 30 years of his decent life, just as they look at your worn shirt now and refuse to see the way you bow your head politely, even to the people who have just mocked you. I've worked beside you for more than a month. I've seen all of it." Reese sat motionless, and something inside his chest, something that had been frozen for 7 years, stirred faintly. It wasn't because she had praised him. He had spent a lifetime hearing flattery 100 times more polished than that. It was because, for the first time, someone had truly seen him. Not the Kane name, not the dishwasher, but him, the man himself, through the smallest things he hadn't even known anyone noticed. He wanted to say something to her, but his throat tightened, and in the end, the only question he could manage was whether, after carrying her father's injustice for 12 years, she had ever hated the neighborhood. Maggie looked out across the lake for a long time, then shook her head. She said that when she was younger, she had hated it deeply, but her mother told her that if she allowed her heart to turn hard, then the people who had falsely condemned her father would have defeated him twice. Her father had lived honorably all his life, and Maggie had to live in such a way that when the truth finally came out, people would have no choice but to lower their heads before the Rowe name. That was why she still smiled at customers and still treated people kindly, not because she was naive, but because it was the only way she had left to keep her father alive within her. The wind rising from the lake turned colder. Maggie stood, brushed off her coat, and said it was late and that she still had a morning shift the next day. Then she hesitated for a second and added that, unless he minded, starting the next night they could walk home together after her shift. That stretch beside the lake felt lonely when a person walked it alone. She knew that better than anyone. She had been walking it alone for 12 years. Reese rose with her, nodded, and said, "I'd be very glad to." And as those two people, both rejected by the same neighborhood, walked side by side beneath the rows of pale yellow streetlights, neither of them spoke another word, but they both felt the same thing. The road seemed shorter that night than it had on any other, and for the first time in many years, that cold city seemed to hold one warm place. From that night by the lakeshore, their days began weaving themselves together quietly and naturally, like two narrow streams finding their way into the same river. Every night after work, Reese waited at the corner near the factory, and the two of them walked home along the lake. Some nights they talked about everything under the sun. Other nights they said nothing at all and simply walked side by side, listening to the waves strike the stone embankment, and both of them came to understand that silence beside someone who understood you was more comforting than 1,000 words spoken to those who never would. One morning, Reese saw Maggie pushing her old bicycle toward the diner. The chain had slipped loose, and the rear tire sagged nearly flat. She intended to take it to a repair shop, but he told her to let him look at it. During his lunch break, he borrowed the diner's tools, turned the bicycle upside down in the back courtyard, tightened the chain, patched the tire, adjusted the brakes, and worked oil into every rusted link. His hands moved with such practiced skill that Dottie stood in the kitchen doorway watching him and narrowed her eyes with a private smile. When Maggie rode the bicycle around the courtyard to test it, it glided as smoothly as though it were new, and she laughed aloud, a clear and radiant sound that surprised even her, because it had been so long since she had heard such laughter come from her own mouth. In return, Maggie began saving food for him. Some days it was the last slice of apple pie in the diner, hidden away before anyone else could take it. Other days it was a container of hot soup she had prepared while helping in the kitchen. She always handed it to him with the same excuse, that throwing it away would be a waste, and he accepted it with the smile of a man who knew perfectly well that it wasn't leftover food. In that way, one small kindness was laid gently upon another. He replaced the burned-out light bulb in the stairwell of her building. She stitched the torn seam along the shoulder of his coat. He learned how to make coffee exactly the way she liked it, strong and without sugar. She memorized his habit of walking on the outside of the sidewalk so she could remain safely nearer the buildings. Before long, the whole neighborhood had grown accustomed to the sight of the two people it had rejected walking side by side every night. One Sunday afternoon, when the diner closed early, Maggie hesitantly asked whether he would like to go with her to visit her mother at the hospital. She quickly added that he didn't have to come, that the question had simply slipped out, but Reese only answered, "I'd very much like to. Let me buy some flowers." The neighborhood hospital was old and crowded. There were no private entrances and no special rooms. 2 patients shared each room, and Maggie's mother lay in the bed nearest the window, a frail woman whose hair had turned more than half silver, though her eyes still held the gentle beauty of her younger years. Maggie introduced him by saying, "This is Reese. He works with me at the diner." Her mother studied him for a long time with the gaze mothers possessed, the kind that could read far more than eyes alone could see. Then she reached out one thin hand, and when Reese took it, she closed her fingers around his with the little strength she still had, and spoke each word slowly. "Reese, I've been lying here a long time. Every week when my daughter comes to visit, I look at her face and try to understand the life she's living. For 12 years, she has smiled only to keep me from worrying. I'm her mother. Of course I knew. But these past few weeks, her smile has changed. She tells me about the diner, about the bicycle, about walking home at night, and her eyes begin to shine. My daughter has suffered her whole life. You're the first person who has made her smile for real since her father died." Maggie let out a soft cry and said, "Mother, why would you say something like that?" Her cheeks turning bright red, but Reese didn't laugh or tease her. He only lowered his head, placed his other hand gently over her mother's, and said, "Ma'am, I'm the one who should be grateful. In this neighborhood, Maggie was the first person who treated me like a human being." Before they left, while Maggie stepped outside to bring back some hot water, her mother motioned for Reese to come closer to the bedside cabinet and asked him to open the drawer. Inside was a small, old picture frame, and she said, Look at this. That was my family when there were still 3 of us. Reese lifted the frame. In the photograph, a middle-aged man with a gentle face stood in front of the church, one arm around a little girl who was smiling so broadly that her eyes had nearly disappeared, the other hand holding a thick ledger. His smile was honest and peaceful, the smile of a man who had never done anything that required him to lower his head in shame. Reese stood silently before that photograph for so long that Maggie's mother had to call his name softly, and no one in that room knew that inside the mind of the man holding the frame, a decision was taking shape, cold and certain as steel, a decision he couldn't yet name but already knew he would never abandon. He returned the photograph to its place with the care of a man setting down something sacred. Late that afternoon, the 2 of them walked home from the hospital beneath the pale golden light of autumn. Maggie told him how her father used to carry her on his shoulders to church every Sunday morning when she was a child. And just as they turned the corner in front of the spa, Kendra Vaughn stepped outside with her group of friends. Kendra's eyes swept over the 2 of them and paused for a second. She didn't need to raise her voice or put on a performance. She merely dropped one sentence in a tone as sweet as sugar mixed with vinegar, loud enough for the entire corner to hear. Look at that. Trash finds trash. What a perfect pair. Her friends giggled, and the group moved past them as though nothing had happened. Maggie kept walking at the same pace. 12 years had taught her how to let words like those slide from her shoulders. But after a few steps, she suddenly realized the man beside her had stopped. She turned around, and for the first time since meeting him, she saw a different Reese. He stood perfectly still, staring after the women without saying a word. But his jaw was locked tightly, and the hand hanging beside him was slowly closing into a fist, the knuckles turning white. There was something so dark and cold in his eyes that a chill moved through her, though she couldn't understand why. She didn't know that the sentence spoken in 3 careless seconds had touched something that should never have been touched. She didn't know that the man standing beside her needed only to take the old phone from his pocket and speak a few words, and before the end of the week, that spa would close forever, while the people who had laughed would learn what it meant to disappear from a city. She knew none of it. She simply followed her heart, stepped closer, and placed her hand over his clenched fist. Her hand was small and warm against his icy knuckles, and she whispered, "Don't, Reese. They aren't worth it. Let's go home." The fist beneath her hand slowly relaxed, his cold fingers gradually warmed. Reese turned to look at her, drew in a deep breath, and the storm in his eyes faded. He nodded and said, "All right, let's go home." They continued walking into the sunset, her hand still holding his, and neither of them let go. Maggie felt peace return to her heart, while Reese silently thought that the woman walking beside him had just done something she would never understand. She had saved the very people who had insulted her, using nothing more than one warm hand and 4 simple words: "They aren't worth it." And he wondered how many people in this world, after being struck by stones, would still reach out to stop those stones from being thrown back. One weekday morning, while the South Side was still moving through its familiar rhythm, a strange man appeared on the main street. He was somewhere in his 40s, wearing a brown leather jacket, with the slow gait of someone in no hurry to reach anywhere, though his eyes missed nothing. He began stopping at one place after another: the barber shop, the gas station, the grocery store, the filling station at the end of the street. Everywhere he went, he ordered something cheap, stayed longer than necessary, and casually asked questions that sounded harmless, such as whether anyone new had moved into the neighborhood recently. A man, perhaps between 30 and 40, someone who had arrived sometime within the past 6 months. He claimed he had a long-lost relative who was rumored to have drifted into the area, but no matter how much he searched, he couldn't find him. He had no photograph to show anyone, only questions, because no photograph existed anywhere in the world of the man he was truly seeking, and that was precisely why his employer, Sal Draco, the head of the second most powerful organization in the city, had been forced to send men searching in the most primitive way possible, knocking on doors one neighborhood at a time across Chicago. In the underworld ordinary people couldn't see. A rumor had been spreading like oil across water. For more than a month, every movement of the Kane family in the Gold Coast had passed through Frankie Moss alone, even at the highest level meetings. The familiar presence of the empty chair in the darkened corner had disappeared. The ghost of Chicago seemed to have vanished from its tower, and to a man as ambitious as Sal Draco, an absent boss was either dead, growing weak, or hiding somewhere. Any one of those possibilities was an opportunity that might never come again, provided Draco found him before anyone else did. Draco's men had been scattered throughout every part of the city for 2 weeks, and that day it was the South Side's turn. Word of the stranger asking questions reached Reese that same afternoon through the diner customers. People speculated that he was probably a debt collector, an undercover police officer, or a property dealer gathering information. Everyone offered a theory, then forgot about it as soon as their food arrived. But behind the kitchen door, the man drying a stack of plates didn't forget. Reese listened to every detail. A man, newly arrived, within the past 6 months. No photograph, only questions. Inside his mind, the pieces automatically fell into place with the speed of a brain that had once governed an empire. No photograph meant the stranger wasn't police and wasn't a private investigator, because people like that always possessed at least one blurred image. Searching without a photograph meant whoever had sent him knew exactly whom he was looking for but had never seen the man's face, and there was only one man in the world whose enemies and the police couldn't produce even a single photograph. That evening, when Maggie asked why he was so quiet, he merely smiled and said he was tired. After his shift, he didn't return directly to his room. He took a long, indirect route through alleys that a month of delivering food at night had taught him, as well as the lines of his own hand, and he found the man in the leather jacket sitting inside a small tavern at the end of the street, at the table beside the window where he could watch the entire road, exactly as a professional would. Reese didn't enter the tavern. He stood in the darkness across the street and watched the man for a long time, then took out the old phone and dialed its only number. When the person on the other end answered, Reese spoke only a few short sentences, slowly and clearly. He gave the name of the tavern, described the man, then added that he needed to know who the man was, whom he owed, where he lived, and everything about his wife and children within 3 hours. Frankie answered with a single word. Understood. Before midnight, the old phone vibrated once. A message appeared on the screen, with no greeting and no explanation. Reese read it, then immediately deleted it. But everything worth remembering was already fixed inside his mind. The man's real name. The exact amount he owed to a gambling house on the west side. A debt even his own employer didn't know about. The name of the street where his wife and daughter lived. Even the diner where he ate breakfast every morning. The next morning, the man in the leather jacket woke in the rented room where he was staying, put on his coat, and prepared for another day of questioning. When he reached into his pocket for his cigarettes, his fingers touched a piece of paper folded into quarters, something he knew with absolute certainty hadn't been there the night before. He opened it, and the color slowly drained from his face as he read each line of neat handwriting. There were no threats and no insults. The paper merely listed the precise amount, down to the last cent, that he owed the gambling house on the west side, the name of the narrow street where his wife and daughter lived in a blue-painted house, the time he visited his usual breakfast diner, and at the bottom, a single line. Someone is watching this neighborhood. Go home. There wasn't one openly threatening word, and that made it 100 times more terrifying, because whoever had written it wanted him to understand one simple thing. While he had been searching for someone else, that person had uncovered his entire life in a single night, and he still didn't know who they were, which side they stood on, or how high their power reached. The experienced man collapsed onto the edge of the bed, cold sweat gathering at the back of his neck, and less than an hour later, people saw him dragging his suitcase toward the bus station, his face still pale, leaving the south side without looking back once. The report he sent to his superiors contained only 4 words. There is nothing here. At lunchtime that day, while they ate quickly after the morning shift, Maggie mentioned it as idle gossip, saying she had heard that the man who had been asking questions all over the neighborhood had packed up and left that morning. She said she had seen him pass in front of the diner the day before, staring at Reese through the window so intently that it had made her nervous, and she asked whether he knew him. Reese looked at her and smiled, the light, easy smile of a man hearing a story that had nothing to do with him. He said yes. The man had stopped him the day before to ask for directions. Apparently, he was searching for some relative, and Reese had told him he had the wrong person. Maggie laughed and said she had been wondering. Then the conversation moved on to something else. She didn't notice that for one very brief second, the eyes of the man sitting across from her had swept past the window and scanned the entire length of the street in a way no dishwasher in the world would ever look at a street. But there was someone else in the neighborhood who hadn't slept well the night before. From the second-floor window of the neighborhood council office, Gordon Pratt had stood in the darkness for a long time, watching the man in the leather jacket drag his suitcase toward the bus station until he disappeared from sight. His thick fingers gripped the windowsill, and on the respectable face he always presented to the neighborhood appeared something none of its residents had ever seen before: unease. Unlike everyone else making careless guesses outside, Gordon Pratt recognized the man. He had seen that face once before, in a place he could never speak of, under circumstances he had spent years trying to forget. The man worked for Sal Draco, and the question that kept Gordon Pratt awake wasn't what Draco's man had come there to do. It was why one of Draco's men had appeared in that particular neighborhood, searching and questioning everyone, only to flee without warning after a single night, as though an invisible hand had just swept him from the board, a hand that even Draco himself had reason to fear. And if that hand was now resting over the neighborhood, could Gordon Pratt's own deepest buried secrets truly remain undisturbed beneath the ground? That Friday night was the night of the regular appointment, the meeting that came once every 2 weeks and that Reese had never missed since the day he arrived on the South Side. Just as they had agreed, close to midnight, he left his rented room and walked 3 blocks to the deserted corner beside an empty lot, a place with no streetlights and no windows facing it. And there, a long, gleaming black car had been waiting for some time, the kind of car no one in the South Side would ever dream of seeing parked on their street. The door opened without a sound. Reese stepped inside, and the car glided smoothly through the night, carrying him across the city toward Northwestern Hospital, where a mother was counting the days as she waited for her son. But that night, something happened beyond anything he had calculated. The night shift at the factory ended later than usual because of a machinery failure, and Maggie finished work close to midnight, exhausted to the bone. She decided to take the shortcut across the empty lot, instead of walking the longer route beside the lake as she normally did. And it was at that turn that she saw him. She saw a figure so familiar that her heart recognized him before her eyes did. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the worn coat whose torn seam she had once repaired, standing at the dark street corner. Then a luxurious black car glided toward him like some great silent animal. The door opened, and the man stepped inside without a second of hesitation, bending into the car with a practiced ease so natural that it seemed he had entered vehicles like that 1,000 times in his life. The car swept away and vanished into the darkness, while Maggie stood frozen across the street behind a tree, her heart pounding all the way into her throat. She remained there for a long time, then walked back to her room on legs she could no longer feel, and that night she didn't sleep. She lay staring at the stained ceiling as questions descended upon her like a flock of black crows. Who was he? Whose car was that? What business could a poor dishwasher, a man so broke that he had counted every last coin on his first day, possibly have with a car she had never dared stand near in her entire life? Was he a thief? A smuggler? A man running from something, with the people in that car as his accomplices? Or worse, did he have a wealthy family somewhere else? A wife, children, and was the South Side only a place where he escaped to play at being poor, while she was nothing more than part of that game? The last thought hurt so badly that she had to sit up in the middle of the night and wrap her arms around her knees. But then, in the darkest hour of her doubt, another memory rose inside her. The memory of her father, standing in the middle of a neighborhood meeting, raising one trembling hand and begging people to give him a chance to speak, while no one did. She remembered herself at 15, hiding behind the hall door, watching neighbors who had eaten her mother's cakes and accepted her father's help repairing their roofs turn their backs on him all at once because of pages in a ledger, without a single one of them troubling to ask him one decent question. She remembered what her mother had said beside his coffin, that they hadn't killed her father with a knife, but by condemning him before they ever listened to him speak. Maggie sat motionless in the darkness, tears sliding down her face before she even realized they were there, and she asked herself who she was to become a judge. What had she truly seen? She had seen a man step into a car, nothing more. She hadn't heard him say a single word, yet in her mind she had already assigned him every possible crime. How was she any different from the people who had killed her father? She lay down again with her decision made. She wouldn't ask him. It wasn't because she didn't want to know. Dear God. She wanted to know so badly it burned inside her, but she had sworn before her father's spirit that for the rest of her life, she would never condemn anyone before giving that person the chance to speak. If one day Reese wished to tell her, then he would tell her himself. She could wait. She had waited 12 years for the truth about her father. She knew how to wait. At that same moment, on the other side of the city, inside the 7th floor room at Northwestern Hospital, Everett sat beside his mother's bed as he did during every other midnight visit, But that night there was something different about him. Something his mother noticed the instant he entered. His face was softer, his shoulders seemed lighter, and when she asked how he had been living, instead of giving his usual answer that everything was fine, he began to tell her. He told her about a small diner where a silver-haired owner made the finest stew he had ever tasted. He told her about washing dishes until both his hands had grown calloused. She listened, growing quieter with every word, until he began telling her about a woman, a waitress on the south side. He said, "Mother, she has so little. She works 2 shifts every day to care for her sick mother. The whole neighborhood turned its back on her because of an injustice that wasn't hers. Yet she was the only person who brought me a cup of hot coffee on the night I was ready to give up. She doesn't know who I am. To her, I'm only a penniless dishwasher. Yet she saves the best piece of pie for me, repairs my coat, and last week, when someone insulted me, she was the one who held my hand and stopped me." Teresa listened without interrupting him once, and across her pale face, a smile slowly began to bloom. Her first smile after months in the hospital. The nurses on duty the following night even whispered among themselves that the elderly woman in room 7 suddenly looked brighter. She took her son's hand, squeezed it gently, and said only one thing. "My Everett, I've prayed for this for so long. Take your time. Don't frighten the girl, but don't make her wait too long either." Near dawn, the black car returned Reese to the same street corner and disappeared into the mist as though it had never existed. He walked back to his rented room through the sleeping neighborhood, his heart feeling strangely light, never knowing that only a few blocks away, inside a small rented room, a woman had finally drifted into sleep after remaining awake all night. From that night forward, something invisible existed between them. Maggie still smiled at him every morning, still saved him a piece of pie, still walked beside him every night after work. No one looking at them would have noticed anything different. But deep inside her chest, the doubt from that night remained exactly where it had begun. It didn't grow because she refused to let it grow. But it didn't disappear either. It rested there like a small thorn lodged in her heart. Not enough to make her bleed, only enough to ache faintly each time she watched him smile, reminding her that the man she was beginning to love still had one closed door she had never been invited to enter. In the days after visiting his mother, Everett knew he had reached a threshold from which he could no longer retreat. His heart had made its choice long ago, perhaps on that night by the lakeshore when Maggie brought him the hot coffee. But the rest of him, the part that had been taught a lesson in blood 7 years earlier, still stood in the doorway demanding one final thing: certainty. He despised himself for even thinking it. The woman who had taken his hand in the street, who had given him the finest piece of pie when she believed he possessed nothing. What more could she possibly have left to prove? But an old scar had its own reasoning. Every night, it whispered that his former fiancée had once been just as gentle, had once spoken words that made him believe, and he had believed her, only to hear the truth through a glass door. This time, before surrendering a heart that had already been broken once, he needed to see the deepest part of another person with his own eyes. Just once. One final test, and then he swore he would never test her again for as long as he lived. He chose the lie as carefully as a jeweler chose the point of an engraving tool. It had to fit perfectly with the shadowy past of Reese Cole, explain all the mystery that had surrounded him, and place Maggie before a choice that only a sincere heart could answer. On Wednesday evening that week, during their familiar walk home along the lakeshore, he was unusually quiet, and when Maggie asked what was wrong, he stopped, turned toward the dark water, and spoke in the voice of a man who had tried to hide something, but could no longer keep it buried. "Maggie, there's something I have to tell you. That stranger who came asking questions around the neighborhood last week, I lied to you. He wasn't looking for a relative. He works for an old creditor of mine from Detroit. Years ago, I borrowed a large amount of money trying to save my repair shop. The shop still failed, but the debt remained. I ran to Chicago to start over and thought I had escaped, but now they've found me. The amount is a fortune to me now, more than I could ever repay. I'll probably have to leave Chicago sometime this week and go as far away as I can. I'm sorry I waited so long to tell you." When he finished, he waited. He waited for tears, for accusations, or worst of all, for the very thing the old scar had whispered to him all along, for her eyes to turn away when she realized he was about to become a burden. But Maggie did none of those things. She only stood very still and looked at him for a long time, before softly saying, "All right. Then they walked the rest of the way in silence. She didn't ask how much he owed. She didn't ask who the creditor was. She didn't say another word until they parted at the entrance to her alley. And throughout that entire night, Everett lay awake, unable for the first time to predict another person's next move, wondering whether he had been wrong, whether her silence itself was the answer. The following afternoon, at the end of their shift, while he was placing the final stack of dishes onto the rack, Maggie entered the back kitchen holding a paper envelope worn along the edges. She stopped in front of him, drew a breath like someone about to leap into deep water, then lifted his still wet hand, placed the envelope in his palm, and closed his fingers around it. He opened it, and inside was money. Old bills pressed flat and arranged neatly, bills carrying the scent of sweat from 2 shifts of work every day. He knew what the money was before she even spoke, because he had seen her counting and recounting those same bills after the evening shift at the end of every month. It was the money for her mother's hospital expenses that month. He froze and said, "Maggie, no, this is your mother's hospital money. I can't take it." But she shook her head, cutting him off, and spoke with the strange calm of someone who had spent an entire sleepless night thinking through every word. "Take it and use it to look after yourself. It's enough for a bus ticket and a few weeks of living expenses while you search for work somewhere else. As for my mother, I'll find another way. I can ask the hospital to wait. I can take another shift. I've been finding ways to survive for 12 years. I'm used to it, but you don't have anyone. You're all alone." She paused, looked directly into his eyes, and finished with the words he would remember for the rest of his life. "A person can be poor in money, Reese, but don't let yourself become poor in hope. If you run away in despair, then you truly lose everything. But if you take this and leave with hope, you'll still have a road that can bring you back." And there, inside that narrow kitchen filled with the smell of soap, something happened that had never happened in all of Everett Kane's 34 years. His hand began to tremble. The hand that had signed papers determining the fate of entire corporations without blinking. The hand that had shaken hands with the most dangerous men in the city without the slightest change in his pulse was trembling violently around a frayed paper envelope containing the most honest money it had ever touched. He lowered his head so she couldn't see his eyes, and it took him some time before he could speak. "Thank you. Give me a few days to think. I promise I won't leave without saying goodbye." That night, after every light in the neighborhood had gone dark, a man sat for a long time beside a crooked wooden table in a miserable rented room. The worn envelope lay before him, and he didn't dare open it to count the money because he knew that if he did, he wouldn't be able to contain himself. Then he took out the old phone, dialed its only number, and spoke briefly. "Frankie, St. Anthony Hospital on the South Side. The patient's name is Mrs. Rowe. Pay every outstanding hospital bill and cover all expenses in advance through the end of the year. Complete anonymity. Do it tonight." The following morning, Maggie was wiping tables during a quiet hour when the telephone rang. The person on the other end was calling from the hospital's billing office, and Maggie had to ask them to repeat the message 3 times before she could believe what she was hearing. "Ma'am, all of Mrs. Rowe's hospital expenses have been paid in full, both the outstanding balance and all upcoming costs, by a benefactor who has requested anonymity. You won't need to make any further payments." Maggie stood in the middle of the diner, unaware that the cleaning cloth had fallen from her hand, her heart racing with something that was equal parts joy and bewilderment. Who in the world would do something like that for her and her mother? She had no wealthy relatives. She knew no one outside that neighborhood, and for one single second, an image flashed through her mind. The black car gliding through the darkness, and the familiar figure bending to enter it. Her heart missed a beat, but she immediately shook her head and laughed at herself. Impossible. What was she thinking? Reese was being hunted by creditors so relentlessly that he had to flee the city. He didn't even have enough money to buy a bus ticket. How could a man running from debt possibly have the money to care for her mother? It must have been the church, or some charitable foundation, or perhaps a kind doctor who wished to remain anonymous. She pushed the thought away and returned to her work, never realizing that she had just placed her hand upon the truth and then released it again. Only the small thorn inside her heart stirred a little more, remaining there in silence, waiting for the day when it would finally be given a name. Although the matter of the man in the leather jacket had ended after a single night, for someone as cautious as Everett, it had never truly ended at all, because in the world he ruled, the first spy was never the last. Draco had caught the scent of the South Side today, and tomorrow he could return with eyes far more discreet. This neighborhood was no longer an anonymous stopping place. It had Dottie, it had a mother lying in St. Anthony Hospital, and it had Maggie, which meant it contained things Everett would never allow anyone to touch. So during his next scheduled contact with Frankie, he gave an order that sounded simple on the surface. I want a complete security review of this entire neighborhood. Make a list of every person who could become an opening. Find out who is in debt, who gambles, who has ties to any gang in the city, especially Draco. I don't want a single door through which anyone can enter this neighborhood without my knowing beforehand. Frankie accepted the order with the thoroughness of a man who had spent 20 years in the profession. And the silent machinery of the Kane family began to turn. People no one noticed appeared throughout the South Side disguised as water meter readers, market researchers, and passing customers sitting quietly in local diners. They didn't ask anyone a single question, but they saw everything. While elsewhere in the city, skilled fingers moved through bank statements, credit records, and ledgers ordinary people believed no one could ever read. 1 week later, the first report arrived, and among the long list of petty matters belonging to a poor neighborhood, a butcher who owed gambling debts, a young man at the gas station who had committed 2 minor thefts, there was one name that made Frankie stop and check the information 3 times before he dared report it, because it seemed so absurd that he assumed his men had made a mistake. That name was Gordon Pratt, chairman of the neighborhood council, the man every background report described with words such as exemplary, respected, and pillar of the community. Yet the trail of money told an entirely different story. For years, through an intermediary account registered to a consulting company that didn't exist, Gordon Pratt had regularly transferred money to a destination anyone in their world would recognize at a glance as one of the channels feeding Sal Draco's organization. That night, during their secret meeting inside the black car, Frankie placed the first file into his boss's hands and said, "I verified it 3 times. There is no mistake." Everett sat in the darkness of the car and turned through the pages one by one, his face growing more silent with each page, because he immediately saw what every number was screaming. How could the chairman of a neighborhood council, a man living on a modest salary and organizing fundraisers to repair a school roof, afford to pay regular tribute to the Mafia for so many years? That money had to come from somewhere, and its source had to be buried somewhere in the past. Everett closed the file and gave Frankie only one instruction: trace the money backward for me, all the way to its source, no matter where it leads. And Frankie traced it, like a man following a red thread through the darkness of time, from one intermediary account to another, through shell companies that had long since been dissolved, through sums divided into smaller amounts, and later combined again to erase their trail. The farther he moved into the past, the thinner the thread became, until it led him to a beginning that made even a man who had witnessed every kind of corruption in that city sit in silence when he reached it. 12 years earlier, the first money deposited into Gordon Pratt's secret account matched, in both amount and timing, the missing funds from the Southside church building account, the money the entire neighborhood had spent 3 years collecting to repair the dome and open free classes for children in need. The money everyone believed had been embezzled by their treasurer, a man named Rowe. The old records were uncovered layer by layer. There were bank statements from the first shell company Gordon himself had created, just before the church funds began disappearing. There were fraudulent invoices bearing Mr. Rowe's signature, signatures that revealed the hesitant strokes of someone copying another man's hand when placed beside the genuine ones beneath magnifying glass. Then there was one detail that completed the horror of it all. At the time, Gordon Pratt had been vice chairman of the neighborhood council and the man responsible for reconciling the fund's accounts, which meant he had been the man stealing the money, the man forging the documents, and the most eager judge standing before the neighborhood to condemn an innocent person. When Mr. Rowe died carrying the injustice to his grave, Gordon took the chairman's seat by climbing over the ruined honor of the man he had destroyed. In the years that followed, when Draco's organization extended its reach into the southern neighborhoods, Gordon used that same blood-stained money to purchase protection so no one would ever dig into his past. The night Frankie delivered the complete report, Everett read every line from the first page to the last, then sat completely still for a very long time, so long that Frankie finally had to call softly, "Boss." When Everett looked up, Frankie, who had stood beside 2 generations of the Kane family, had to admit silently that he had never seen those eyes look that way before. There was no fire in them, no rage, only coldness, a still coldness, like the surface of a frozen lake, with a bottomless abyss beneath it. In Everett's mind were not only the pages of the report, but the gentle face of the man in the photograph holding a thick ledger outside the church, Maggie's steady voice beside the lake as she described the meetings where her father had been judged, the image of a 15-year-old girl hiding behind the hall door while an entire neighborhood turned its back on her father, and the thin hand of a mother who had spent 12 years confined to bed because of an injustice that had never belonged to her family. Frankie quietly asked how his boss wanted the matter handled. All it would take was one word, and both men understood what that word could accomplish. But Everett slowly shook his head and said, "No, Frankie, not that way. This man killed a decent man by stealing his honor in front of the entire neighborhood, so he must repay the debt with that same thing, before that same neighborhood, in broad daylight, and under the law. The name of the dead must be cleared publicly, just as the shame was placed upon it publicly. Prepare every piece of evidence to courtroom standards. Clean, complete, flawless. Then wait for my order. Everything must happen at the right moment. But in this world, guilty men often hear danger sooner than innocent ones. And during those weeks, Gordon Pratt began sleeping badly. He knew nothing specific. He only sensed it. The instinct of an old fox catching something unfamiliar in the air. The water meter reader who stared too long at the neighborhood council office. The call from the bank asking him to verify an old transaction no one had questioned in years. The contact within Draco's organization who suddenly grew cold when Gordon tried to ask about the man in the leather jacket. All those fine threads wove themselves into a vague but persistent fear that some invisible hand was following his trail. And with the natural instinct of a guilty man, Gordon looked across the neighborhood he had controlled so tightly for 12 years and tried to discover where the disturbance had begun. His eyes settled upon the only place containing something beyond his control, the diner on the corner, where a stranger with no known past had appeared at precisely the moment everything began slipping from its path. And inside the mind of that frightened man, a decision took shape. Reese Cole had to be driven out of the South Side, at any cost, and as quickly as possible. Gordon Pratt had spent 12 years at the top of that neighborhood, and he knew better than anyone what weapon had carried him there. It wasn't a gun. It wasn't money. It was the tongue of the crowd. 12 years earlier, he had used it to bury a decent man, and now he decided to use the same method again. He began carefully, like a gardener sowing poisonous weeds. He made no public declaration, only dropped quiet remarks in the right places. To the woman who owned the grocery store, he clicked his tongue and said, "I know someone at the district police station. They say they've been watching a man wanted in another state who drifted into our neighborhood, around 35, arrived sometime within the past 6 months. Think about it. Does anyone around here fit that description?" To the barber, he sighed and said, "I'm worried about that dishwasher at Dottie's diner. No papers, no background, no one who knows where he came from. He wanders the streets late every night. Why would an honest man need to live so mysteriously?" And to the Parents' Association, he lowered his voice and said, "I'm not claiming anything for certain, but it's always better to be careful. Any household with daughters should warn them." A rumor spoken by a respected chairman traveled 3 times faster than an ordinary rumor. Within a week, the entire neighborhood was whispering that Reese Cole was a fugitive. Some said he was wanted for fraud. Others swore it was for violence. And like every rumor, the farther it traveled, the more teeth and claws it grew. Gordon's second blow struck directly at Dottie's livelihood. During a neighborhood council meeting, he rose with the pained expression of a man forced to do something difficult and said, "Friends, I warned Dottie privately some time ago about sheltering a man of uncertain identity, but she chose not to listen. Now the safety of our entire neighborhood may be at risk. I have no authority to forbid anyone from doing business, but I ask all of you to consider carefully. Every dollar we spend is a vote for the place where we spend it." That appeal worked like an unwritten ban. Dottie's diner grew emptier each day. Customers who had eaten there for 30 years looked away when she stood at the door. Some even crossed the street to avoid greeting her. Revenue fell to almost nothing, and Reese stood in the kitchen looking out at the rows of empty tables with a heart as heavy as stone. He told Dottie to let him go. If he left, the customers would return. The diner was her whole life, but the silver-haired woman polishing a glass suddenly slammed it onto the counter, turned toward him with fury burning in her eyes, and said, "What did you just say? 30 years ago, I opened this diner with nothing but my 2 empty hands and one promise. that the door over there would never be closed in the face of a decent person. I would rather sell this place than sell that promise. If you leave without my permission, don't ever show your face to me again." Then she turned away quickly, but not quickly enough to hide the trembling of her shoulders. The iron woman of the neighborhood was exhausted, and each day Reese watched her force herself to stand inside that empty diner. Something in his chest tightened a little more. Then came that Saturday afternoon, when the final nail was driven into place. Only 2 tables were occupied when the door opened, and Kendra Vaughn entered with 2 friends. They hadn't come to eat. They ordered 3 glasses of water and began talking loudly enough for everyone in the diner to hear. They said they had heard the police would soon come to arrest the fugitive hiding in their neighborhood. How frightening, they said, and yet someone was still willing to keep company with him. Then Kendra turned fully toward Maggie, who was standing behind the counter, smiled with sharp sweetness, and delivered the sentence she had prepared before leaving home. "But I suppose it makes sense. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. You chose someone just like your father, didn't you? Theft and running from the law. What a perfect match." The entire diner fell silent. Dottie froze before she could react. And Maggie, the woman who had lowered her head and endured for 12 years, who had allowed thousands of cruel words to slide from her shoulders like water, slowly placed her tray on the counter that day, walked around it, and stood straight before Kendra. When she spoke, her voice didn't tremble. "Miss Kendra, you may laugh at me however you please. I've heard it all for 12 years. But today I'm going to say this once so the entire neighborhood can hear. My father never took a cent from anyone in his life. He died because people like you condemned him without evidence, armed only with a loud mouth and a crowd too lazy to think. And Reese, the man you call a fugitive, whom has he harmed in the 6 months he has lived here? Name one person. Go ahead. He washes dishes to support himself. He gives his seat to elderly people on the bus. He repaired the little girl next door's bicycle and didn't charge her anything. His only crime is being poor, and if poverty is a crime, then this entire neighborhood belongs in prison. You killed my father with rumors. As long as I'm alive, you will not use rumors to destroy another decent man in front of me." When she finished, the diner was so quiet that the turning ceiling fan could be heard. Kendra stood, pulled her 2 friends toward the door, and tried to save face with one final glare, but her complexion had already gone pale. Several customers lowered their eyes to their plates, and Maggie returned behind the counter, hiding both hands beneath the wooden surface as they shook violently from the anger that had just passed through her. She had defended him before the entire neighborhood with every ounce of trust she possessed, while deep within her own heart, the thorn from the night of the black car remained exactly where it was, pricking her as though in mockery. She was defending a man whose real name she couldn't even be certain of, and never before had her faith felt both so powerful and so unsteady. Reese had watched everything from behind the kitchen door. He watched that slender woman stand alone in the middle of the diner and place herself before him like a shield. He watched the silver-haired owner struggle each day to keep her empty diner alive because she refused to dismiss him. 2 women who shared no blood with him and didn't know who he truly was were paying the price for protecting him. In that moment, every calculation Everett Kane had made about timing collapsed, leaving room for only one truth. It was enough. He had found the answer he had come to that neighborhood seeking, and in truth, he had found it long ago. He had simply been selfish enough to prolong the brief part of his life in which he could be an ordinary man who was loved. But his performance was now forcing innocent people to pay in his place, and a boss never allowed anyone else to settle his debts. He removed the wet apron, folded it neatly, placed it on the shelf, and told himself in silence that it was time to bring the performance to an end. That night, after the diner closed, Reese told Maggie not to go home yet. He said he wanted to take her to the lakeshore for a while because there was something he needed to tell her. Maggie saw something different in his face, and her heart suddenly began beating faster. She nodded, and the 2 of them walked side by side along the familiar road, the road that had carried their footsteps every night for the past 6 months. But that night neither of them spoke until they stopped at the old stone bench, the very place where, on a cold and windy night, a young woman coming home from work had reached over the shoulder of a stranger with a cup of hot coffee and told him that she knew what it felt like to have an entire neighborhood look at you as though you didn't deserve to exist. Lake Michigan was calm that night, and the distant city lights still scattered gold across the dark water as they always had. Reese turned to face her, drew in a long breath, then spoke in a low, measured voice. "Maggie, 6 months ago, I came to this neighborhood with empty hands and a heart that had been frozen for a very long time. I didn't trust anyone. I didn't believe in human kindness, and I didn't believe in love. I thought I would live the rest of my life that way. Then you appeared, with a hot cup of coffee, with the slice of pie you saved for me, with the hand that held mine in the street, and with the way you stood in the middle of the diner this afternoon, shielding me as though you were 6 feet tall. You never gave me anything grand. You only gave me small things, but those small things melted the ice that nothing had been able to touch for 7 years. I'm poor. I have nothing in my hands to promise you except these 2 hands, and one thing I know more certainly than anything else in this world. I love you, Maggie Rowe, and I want to ask you something. Then he slowly lowered himself onto one knee upon the cold stone, reached into his coat, and took out a small box, wrapped in worn cloth. When he opened it, a thin silver ring lay inside, painfully simple. He looked up at her and finished. Will you marry me? The wind rose from the lake. Maggie stood there with both hands covering her mouth, and tears spilled from her eyes, the tears Reese had prepared himself to receive. What he hadn't prepared for was the movement of her head. She shook it slowly, painfully, and with unmistakable resolve. Through her tears she said, I'm sorry, Reese. I can't. The world of the man kneeling before her seemed to stop for a single beat. He slowly stood, the ring box still open in his hand, and quietly asked why. Don't you love me? Maggie released a sound that was half laughter and half sob. I do, dear God. I love you more than I've ever allowed myself to admit. That's what makes this so painful. Don't you understand? If I didn't love you, everything would be so much easier. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and drew in a deep breath like someone gathering the courage to release a truth she had hidden for too long. But I can't marry you when I still haven't dared ask who you are, Reese. The black car that night. I saw it. She looked directly into his eyes as she spoke, and she saw his shoulders stiffen. She continued slowly, each word arranged by many sleepless nights inside her heart. I finished work late that night and took the shortcut across the empty lot. I saw you standing at the dark corner. I saw that car come for you, the kind of car people in this neighborhood wouldn't dare dream of touching. And I saw the way you stepped inside, as naturally as though you were entering your own home. I stood behind a tree with my heart nearly breaking apart. I asked myself 1,000 times who you were. Then someone suddenly paid every one of my mother's hospital bills. Then I noticed the way you watch the street whenever something happens, and the way you become silent whenever anyone asks about Detroit. I'm not stupid, Reese. I simply chose not to ask. My father died because people condemned him before allowing him to speak. So I swore I would never condemn anyone before that person had the chance to tell the truth in their own words. I waited for you to speak. I've waited for a very long time. And now you're kneeling before me and asking me to marry you when I'm not even certain Reese is your real name. How am I supposed to answer you? Her voice caught, and then she spoke the final sentence, softly but clearly through the sound of the waves. I don't need you to be rich, Reese. I never needed that. I only need you to be real. That's all. Reese stood in silence for a long time, the wind moving through his hair, and something strange was happening inside his chest. Her refusal should have felt like a blade. Yet instead it felt like a door being thrown wide open, because in that moment he understood with perfect clarity that the woman standing before him had passed a final test he hadn't even meant to give her. She had refused a marriage proposal because she wouldn't build a life upon a lie, even a gentle one. She would rather lose him than close her eyes and marry a man she had never been allowed to know completely. A woman like that, a woman so worthy of the truth, deserved to hear it. Not as a whisper in the darkness, but openly, honorably, in the light of day. He closed the ring box, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat beside his heart, then stepped closer and looked deeply into her tear-filled eyes. When he spoke, his voice was one she had never heard before. It was still his voice, yet it belonged to another man, lower, steadier, each word as solid as stone. You're right, Maggie. You deserve to know who I am, and I promise you, this is the final promise Reese Cole will ever make. Tomorrow, at exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon, at Dottie's Diner, I will show you who I am. I won't tell you privately in some dark corner. I'll do it in front of everyone, in front of the entire neighborhood that laughed at you, laughed at me, and laughed at your father. All you have to do is come and wait for me until 5 o'clock. Maggie stared at him, confused by a change she couldn't name. She wanted to ask more, but he only took her hand gently and said, Trust me one final time, just one more day. Then he walked her home to the entrance of her alley and stood watching until the door of her building closed behind her. The moment she disappeared from sight, the man turned away, and beneath the streetlight, not a trace of the gentle dishwasher remained on his face. He took the old phone from his pocket, dialed its only number, and raised it to his ear. The instant the person on the other end answered, he spoke briefly, coldly, and clearly, like an order that had been sharpened for many weeks. "Frankie, it's time. Send the complete file to the police through the anonymous channel tonight. Put the legal team on standby and prepare the cars. Tomorrow, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, on the south side, I'm taking back my name." The following morning, Reese arrived at the diner earlier than usual, and the first thing he did wasn't roll up his sleeves and begin working through the pile of dishes, but sit down across from Dottie, look directly into the eyes of the woman who had taken him in, and say, "Dottie, I'm asking you to help me with one final thing. You may think I've lost my mind, but please spread the word throughout the neighborhood for me. At 5 o'clock this afternoon, here at the diner, Reese Cole has something he wants to say in front of everyone. Anyone who wants to hear it may come. I promise you, after 5 o'clock today, your diner will never be empty again." Dottie studied him for a long time, with the gaze of a woman who had spent 6 months making guesses about who he truly was. Then she didn't ask a single question. She only nodded and said, "All right, I'm old now. Life doesn't give me many chances to witness something strange anymore." And she did exactly as he asked. She called several of the women who ran shops nearby, sent word through the florist, and told the young man who delivered the milk. Just like every piece of news in that neighborhood, the message had traveled throughout the South Side before noon, accompanied by every possible version of the story. The fugitive dishwasher was going to confess publicly. No, he was planning to kneel and beg the whole neighborhood for forgiveness. That wasn't it. He was about to be arrested, and wanted to give one final performance before going to prison. Every mouth added another detail, and curiosity, the greatest power in every poor neighborhood, did the rest. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, people had already begun arriving in small groups. Dottie's diner, which had stood nearly empty throughout the entire week, gradually filled until there was no room left. People ordered drinks for the sake of courtesy, then settled in to wait. Those who couldn't find seats stood along the sidewalk outside. Children were sent to play at neighbors' homes so the adults could go watch the spectacle. Within the crowd, which grew thicker by the minute, were all the familiar faces from the past 6 months. The customers who had mocked him, the women from the laundromat, and of course Kendra Vaughn. She arrived at 4:30 and chose the table in the center of the diner as though selecting the finest seat in a theater. With her lips painted red and one leg crossed over the other, she told her 2 friends in a voice loud enough for half the diner to hear, "Of course I had to come. How many times in life do you get to watch a dishwasher put on a show? Let's see what stunt he tries before he crawls out of this neighborhood." In the most discreet corner of the diner, Gordon Pratt sat alone beside a cup of coffee. He had arrived before anyone else, though he pretended he had merely stopped in by chance, because to him, that afternoon seemed like a gift from heaven. The only stranger in the neighborhood, the single thorn in his side, was about to stand before the crowd and say something, and 12 years of experience had taught Gordon that this crowd would devour any powerless man who stood before it to confess. Reese was about to destroy his own reputation. Gordon only needed to sit there, sip his coffee, watch it happen, then give one final push to drive the man out of the South Side. Once Reese was gone, the invisible hand tracing Gordon's trail, if it truly existed, would lose its eyes within the neighborhood. He looked at his watch and smiled, never realizing that he and Kendra, the 2 people most eager for the moment to arrive, were sitting there waiting for the exact instant of their own downfall. Maggie arrived 10 minutes before 5. She hadn't slept all night. She slipped through the crowd and took her place beside Dottie behind the counter, her eyes searching for him, and found him standing at the far end of the diner. He still wore the same old shirt, frayed at the shoulders, and he still had the same face, but something about him had changed in a way she couldn't name. He stood perfectly straight, his arms resting loosely at his sides, and as his gaze passed over the noisy crowd, it was as calm as the surface of a lake. His eyes met hers, and he gave the slightest nod, as though telling her, "I'm here. I kept my promise." The clock on the diner wall crept forward. 5 minutes before 5. 2 minutes. 1. The voices in the room grew louder. Someone impatiently tapped a spoon against a cup. Kendra giggled and said perhaps the man had become so frightened that he had run away. Then the minute hand reached 12. At exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon, as though the whole city had arranged it in advance, the low, smooth sound of engines rose from the far end of the street. The crowd on the sidewalk moved aside without being told, and 3 long, gleaming black cars glided forward and stopped directly in front of the diner, aligned with perfect precision, like 3 pieces placed upon a board by an invisible hand. The entire neighborhood held its breath. Cars like these didn't belong on the South Side. They belonged to a world the people there had only ever seen in films. Every door opened at the same moment, and men in black suits stepped out, tall, silent, moving with the clean precision of a machine. They entered the diner, and the crowd parted into a path without a single instruction. At their head walked a man of about 40 with graying hair, calm eyes, and a suit without a single crease. He crossed the center of the diner, past Kendra's table as she sat with her mouth open, past Gordon Pratt's corner as the man slowly went rigid, and walked straight toward the dishwasher in the worn shirt standing at the far end of the room. Then, before the eyes of the entire neighborhood, the graying man and every guard behind him stopped together and bowed, deeply, formally, absolutely. 2 words rang clearly through the deathly silent diner. "Boss." No one breathed. A spoon slipped from someone's hand and struck the floor with a sound that seemed deafening. Kendra sat as though turned to stone, the smile frozen halfway across her lips. Dottie gripped the edge of the counter, and Maggie stood with both hands pressed tightly against her chest, her heart pounding as though it might break free from her ribs, staring at her man, the same man who had knelt before her the previous night with a thin silver ring, now standing within a sweeping arc of bowed heads. Reese, or rather, the man who had borrowed the name Reese for the past 6 months, slowly looked across the diner, without haste, like the owner of a house surveying his own home. Then he straightened, and that single movement alone caused several people to take an involuntary half-step backward, because this was no longer the stooped, patient posture of a dishwasher. It was the bearing of a man born to stand at the highest point, his shoulders open, his chin raised, his eyes moving across the crowd with a weight that felt like lead. When he spoke, his voice no longer belonged to Reese. It was lower, colder, every word falling clearly like a hammer striking stone. "Thank you all for coming. For the past 6 months, you have known me as Reese Cole, an unemployed mechanic from Detroit, the dishwasher at Dottie's Diner. Today, I'm returning that name." He paused for exactly 1 beat, long enough for the entire diner to lean toward him, then said, "My name is Everett Kane." Those 3 words fell into the diner like a boulder breaking through the surface of a frozen lake. For 1 second, there was absolute silence. Then whispers shattered from every direction. Kane. Which Kane? Surely not that Kane. Dear God. It was the name that appeared in the newspapers whenever the city was shaken. The name police officers spoke with caution, and businessmen mentioned only in lowered voices. The name everyone knew, but no one had ever attached to a face. People had always said the Kane boss wasn't real, that he was only a monster invented to frighten others. Yet now that monster was standing in the poorest diner on the South Side, wearing the worn shirt they had mocked with their own mouths. For 6 months, the most powerful man in Chicago had lived among them, eaten Dottie's stew, washed every plate they had used, surrendered his seat on the bus to the elderly men and women of the neighborhood, and listened to every insult, every malicious rumor, every laugh behind his back. The thought moved down the spine of every person in the diner like a stream of ice. Those who had laughed the loudest now tried to make themselves the smallest. In the middle of the shock spreading across every face, Everett Kane remained still, calmly waiting for the whispers to fade. Then his gaze began to move, slowly and deliberately. It passed over Kendra Vaughn, whose face had gone deathly pale, making her shrink into her chair. But it didn't stop there. His eyes continued across every row of tables and every face like a searching beam of light, until at last they stopped and fixed themselves upon the most discreet corner of the diner, where Gordon Pratt sat motionless beside his coffee, now completely cold. His thick hands clutched the edge of the table, and from the respectable face of the neighborhood chairman, the blood was draining away little by little. The first person to break the silence was Kendra Vaughn herself. She sprang to her feet so abruptly that her chair toppled backward. Then, as though her legs could no longer support her, she stumbled away from the table, crossed the diner beneath hundreds of watching eyes, and collapsed to her knees before Everett. The proudest woman in the neighborhood, the woman who had once declared that the dishwasher could work his entire life and still never afford the shoes she wore, was now kneeling on the diner's tiled floor, her voice trembling and broken as she said, "Mr. Kane, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. The things I said at the dance, the things I said to Maggie, please forgive me. I was foolish." The entire diner held its breath, waiting for an explosion of fury. People had heard enough stories about how the underworld punished those who insulted its leaders, but Everett only looked down at the woman kneeling before him. There was no anger in his eyes, only a distant and weary sadness. Then he spoke with a calmness that seemed almost unnatural. "Miss Vaughn, stand up and listen carefully. You don't owe me an apology. Everything you said to the dishwasher named Reese Cole has already been received. Those words can't be taken back. You owe only yourself one question." He bent slightly and looked directly into her terrified eyes, asking each word slowly. "If I had been wearing a suit that day instead of an apron, would you have laughed in my face? Go home, close the door, and answer that question when you are alone. Your true character lies in that answer, not in the shoes you wear." Kendra remained on her knees for another moment, her face as white as though someone had struck her without ever raising a hand. Then she staggered upright and retreated to the corner of the diner, and no one heard her speak another word for the rest of that afternoon. Everett turned away, and only then did his gaze return to the secluded corner where Gordon Pratt still sat motionless. He said, "But I'm not standing here today because of what happened to me. My story is a small one. I'm standing here for a man who can no longer stand here for himself." He raised one hand. Nothing more needed to be said. The graying man named Frankie stepped forward and placed a thick brown file in his hand. Everett carried it through the diner as the crowd parted before him. He walked directly to the table in the corner and laid the file on the wooden surface in front of Gordon Pratt. He set it down gently, but in the deathly silence of the diner, the sound of paper touching wood rang out like a door slamming shut. Everett spoke loudly enough for the entire room to hear, though his eyes remained fixed upon one man. "Mr. Chairman, inside this file are the original bank records, the original account books, and the results of a forensic handwriting examination. Every piece of evidence tells the same story. 12 years ago, the building fund belonging to this neighborhood's church wasn't embezzled by Mr. Rowe. It was drained through a shell company, and that company was created by you, Mr. Pratt. The invoices bearing Mr. Rowe's signature contained traced forgeries. You were the person responsible for reconciling the accounts that year. You were also the man who organized the meetings that condemned him, and throughout the years that followed, you were the man who regularly transferred money to Sal Draco's organization to purchase silence and ensure that no one would ever dig into the past. For 12 years, you have sat in a chairman's seat built from the stolen honor of an innocent man, and you have slept peacefully upon it." The diner seemed to erupt without making a sound. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the corner table. Gordon Pratt rose shakily to his feet, stammering, "This is slander. This is a lie. Are you going to believe the word of a criminal boss? Or believe me? I have served this neighborhood my entire life." But his voice broke on the final word, and not one person in the diner spoke in his defense. Not one. The same crowd that had followed him in condemning an innocent man 12 years earlier now stared at Gordon with the very eyes they had once turned upon Mr. Rowe. Everett continued, still perfectly calm. "You don't have to believe me, Mr. Pratt, and I haven't come here to judge you. I don't have that authority. But the people about to walk through that door do." At that exact moment, the sound of vehicles came from outside. 2 police cars stopped behind the 3 black cars, and the officers entered the diner. The man leading them held up a warrant and spoke clearly. "Gordon Pratt, last night we received a report and supporting evidence through an anonymous channel. The district attorney's office has reviewed the material and signed a warrant. You are required to accompany us for questioning regarding allegations of embezzlement, document forgery, and financial dealings with a criminal organization. You have the right to remain silent and the right to retain an attorney." No handcuffs were raised. No one pushed him. There was only a 60-year-old man who seemed to age all at once within 10 seconds. He looked around the diner, searching for a single pair of eyes willing to defend him, but found only faces turning away. Then he lowered his head and shuffled between the 2 officers. He passed Everett without daring to look up. He passed the counter where Maggie stood, and for one moment, he hesitated as though he meant to say something to her. But he didn't. He continued toward the door, stepped into the police car, and when the door closed, 12 years of lies were sealed inside with him. Everett returned to the center of the diner, and only then did he speak the words he had prepared on the night he stood before the photograph in the hospital. He spoke slowly and clearly, each word driven into the walls like a nail no one would ever be able to remove. To everyone in the South Side, I declare before you today, based upon the complete body of evidence, now in the hands of the law, that Mr. Rowe, the father of Maggie Rowe, the treasurer of this church, the man this neighborhood has called a thief for 12 years, was innocent. He never took a single cent from the community fund. He lived as a decent man and died beneath a false accusation. Beginning this afternoon, whenever any of you speak of him, I ask that you return to him the name he deserved all along, kind Mr. Rowe. Behind the counter, Maggie began to cry. She made no sound, but her shoulders shook violently as Dottie wrapped her arms around her, her own eyes red with tears. It wasn't the crying of pain. It was 12 years being released from her chest all at once. 12 years of walking with her head lowered through whispers. 12 years of swallowing the word thief with every meal. 12 years of lighting incense for her father without daring to promise him anything because she had never known what promise she could keep. All of it was pouring from her now, through her tears. Around her, a scene unlike anything the neighborhood had ever witnessed began to unfold. One neighbor after another lowered their head. The elderly barber removed his hat and held it against his chest. The woman from the grocery store lifted a handkerchief to her eyes. Someone whispered, "Dear God, what have we done to that family?" An older woman stepped toward the counter, took Maggie's hand with trembling fingers, and said, "Maggie, I was one of the people who threw stones at your house all those years ago. I don't dare ask you to forgive me. I only ask that you allow me to visit your father's grave and light a stick of incense for him." After her came another person, then another. Gray heads bowing before the waitress they had still avoided only the day before. Everett stood silently and watched, never interfering, allowing the neighborhood to perform the duty it had owed the Rowe family for 12 years. When the apologies gradually faded, he stepped forward and stopped before Maggie. She raised her tear-soaked face toward him, toward the man whose name made an entire city tremble, the man who had just returned her father's honor in the full light of day. Everett looked at her with eyes that had softened as though they had never known coldness, and he spoke quietly, just loudly enough for her to hear. "Don't cry yet, Maggie. There is still one final truth I owe you." Everett turned toward Frankie and gave a slight nod. The gray-haired man understood at once and quietly signaled for the guards to withdraw outside. The crowd in the diner seemed to understand that their part was over as well, and people gradually moved aside until, in the little restaurant that had witnessed everything, only a small open space remained with two people standing face to face. Everett reached into the inside pocket of his old shirt, and the first thing he took out wasn't the ring box, but a paper envelope worn along the edges. The envelope Maggie recognized immediately. He lifted her hand, placed it in her palm, and gently closed her fingers around it, exactly as she had once done to him in the kitchen. Then he spoke in a low voice. "I'm giving this back to you. Every dollar is still here. I never spent any of it, and I never intended to. Maggie, there was no creditor from Detroit. There was no debt. I invented it. It was a test. I wanted to know what you would do if I had nothing left and was about to lose even my future, and you gave me the most precious thing you had, the money for your mother's hospital care. The anonymous person who paid all her bills that night was me." He lowered his head and spoke the most difficult part. 7 years ago, the woman I intended to marry betrayed me. She loved my money, not me. After that, I couldn't bring myself to trust anyone again, and that was why I was cowardly enough to test your heart. I'm sorry." Maggie stood motionless and listened to every word. Then the anger came, slowly but with tremendous force. Her cheeks flushed, and her eyes filled with tears entirely different from the ones she had shed moments earlier. Her voice tightened as she said, "You lied to me. You watched me lose sleep because I was worried about you. You watched me ask the hospital to delay the payment. You watched me count every dollar, and all the while you were sitting there grading me like an examination, weren't you? That night when I saw the black car, all those times I bit my own tongue and refused to let myself doubt you. All along I was protecting my faith in a man who was testing me. Do you understand how cruel that was?" She pushed the envelope back against his chest, turned her face away, and her shoulders began to tremble. Everett didn't defend himself. He stood and accepted every word, allowing them to fall upon him like stones. Only when she had finished did he speak, very softly. "Everything you said is true. I'm not asking you to forgive me now. I'm only asking you to hear one final thing. You weren't the only person who was deceived for the past 6 months. I deceived myself too. I convinced myself that I controlled this game, that I could test another person, while keeping my own heart outside it. But I lost, Maggie. I lost from the moment you brought me that hot coffee beside the lake, on the night you told the most defeated man in the neighborhood that he wasn't alone. Every test became meaningless after that. I simply didn't have the courage to admit it sooner. Maggie turned back and looked at him for a long time, at the most powerful man in the city standing before her with the eyes of someone who knew he was guilty and didn't dare ask for mercy. Then, through her anger, she saw what her heart had recognized long ago. Behind all the disguises and all the tests was a wounded man, a man who had spent 7 years unable to believe that he deserved to be loved, a man as lonely and scarred as she was. Her anger slowly faded, giving way to an immense tenderness. She released a long breath, wiped her eyes, and spoke in a voice that was still unsteady but had softened. I need you to hear this clearly, Mr. Kane. I don't love any powerful boss. I don't know any powerful boss. I love the dishwasher from Dottie's diner, the man who arrived early and left late, repaired my bicycle, saved the best piece of pie for me, and walked on the outside of the sidewalk so I could stay safely inside. That is the man I love. So before you say whatever you came here to say, you must promise me one thing. That man can never disappear. Whether you wear a suit or an apron, whether you live in a mansion or a rented room, my dishwasher must always remain inside you. Can you promise me that? Everett looked at her, and for the second time in his life, the eyes of that man grew hot with tears. He said, I promise, by both of my names. Then he stepped back half a pace, drew the small box wrapped in worn cloth from his breast pocket, and lowered himself onto one knee on the tiled floor of the diner, in the middle of the very scratches he had spent 6 months scrubbing clean. He opened the box. Inside was still the same thin, simple silver ring from the night before. He hadn't replaced it with diamonds. He hadn't exchanged it for gold. He looked up at her and spoke slowly, one word at a time. Maggie Rowe. Everett Kane possesses everything in this world, yet he has never once been loved. Reese Cole possesses nothing, yet you loved him. So today, both of us are kneeling here together. You may marry whichever one you choose, because both of them are me. Will you become my wife? And this time, in the diner where she had waited tables for 12 years, before the owner who was crying and the neighbors holding their breath, Maggie nodded. She nodded as tears streamed down her face and said, Yes, I will. The entire diner erupted. Applause and congratulations filled the room. Dottie wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron and laughed as she scolded them, saying that the two of them had left an old woman with no tears remaining. Everett slipped the silver ring onto the calloused finger of the woman he loved, rose, and gathered her against his chest. Over her shoulder, he saw Frankie standing in the doorway with a smile, the smile of the man who had walked beside him from the very beginning of the road. In the days that followed, repayment came to the neighborhood like an early spring. Dottie's diner was completely renovated, with a new roof, a new kitchen, and new tables and chairs. But the old wooden sign bearing the words Dottie's Diner remained exactly where it had always been, because Everett had made only one request, that some old things were more precious than anything new. And just as he had promised, the diner was never empty again. People came to taste the famous stew and listen to the silver-haired owner tell the story again and again of the most remarkable dishwasher she had ever known. Maggie's mother was taken in a specially equipped vehicle to the finest treatment unit at Northwestern Hospital, where the best doctors in Chicago bowed to greet her as though greeting their own mother. And there, on a sun-filled afternoon, a meeting took place that Everett had waited 6 months to see. Holding Maggie's hand, he led her into the room on the 7th floor, where Teresa sat propped against her pillows, waiting with her hair carefully combed and her eyes shining brightly. Maggie was still standing awkwardly with her hands folded in greeting, when Teresa reached out her thin hand, grasped hers firmly, and pulled her down to sit on the edge of the bed. She studied Maggie without blinking for a long time, as though trying to gather every detail of her face into her heart. Then she turned toward her son, smiled, and said, Everett, go outside and buy your mother a cup of tea. The two women in your life need a little time to speak alone. Everett and Maggie's wedding was held on an early winter day, when the first snowflakes of the season still seemed hesitant to fall, and it didn't take place in any magnificent hotel in the Gold Coast, as people had predicted, but in the broad courtyard before the Southside Church, the very place where the Rowe family had been abandoned 12 years earlier, and where the entire neighborhood had now gathered to witness the daughter of kind Mr. Rowe walk down the aisle. The courtyard was decorated with white flowers and strings of warm golden lights, while long tables covered in white cloth were filled with Dottie's famous stew. For that day, she had temporarily set aside her checkered apron to wear the finest dress she had ever owned and take the place of Maggie's late father, escorting the bride and placing her hand into the groom's, while Frankie stood beside Everett as his witness, solemn and dignified, though his eyes remained red with emotion. The neighborhood children were the happiest people at the ceremony. Little girls in flowing white dresses carried flower baskets and scattered handfuls of rose petals along the aisle, while boys wearing bow ties ran joyfully around the long tables. Their clear laughter filled the courtyard and blended with the sound of violins, making the ceremony feel more like a celebration for the entire neighborhood than a wedding. When Maggie appeared in her simple wedding gown, with one white flower tucked into her hair, the whole neighborhood fell silent, then rose together. The very people who had once whispered behind her back now applauded until their palms turned red, as though they were trying to use the sound of that applause to repay 12 years of silence. In the front row, Teresa sat dressed in ivory. Her health had improved noticeably during the previous weeks, and the doctors told one another that good medicine was only part of the reason, while the greater part was joy. When the ceremony ended and the newly married couple came to greet her, she took her daughter-in-law's hand between both of her thin hands, studied her for a long time, then spoke slowly and clearly so Everett could hear every word. "Maggie, my daughter, throughout my life I asked heaven for only one thing, and today my prayer has been answered. Thank you for loving my boy, not his family name. From now on, I can live every day that remains with peace and happiness in my heart." Maggie bent down and embraced her mother-in-law, and the two women cried together beneath the applause of the entire neighborhood. Everett stood beside them, the man feared by the whole city, quickly wiping the corner of his eye while believing no one had noticed, though Dottie saw everything and smiled to herself throughout the celebration. Many months later, life on the South Side had begun a new chapter. Gordon Pratt's case ended according to the law with a just and severe sentence. The church fund was fully restored, and a free community school bearing Mr. Rowe's name was opened beside the church. Maggie's mother could now sit in her wheelchair in the park and enjoy the afternoon sunlight, and on weekends, people could still witness a sight that astonished every newcomer to the neighborhood. A luxurious black car would be parked modestly at the corner, while inside the crowded Dottie's diner, a young woman wearing an apron carried trays of steaming stew to the tables, smiling brightly as she greeted every familiar customer. She was the wife of the most powerful man in Chicago, yet she still returned from time to time to help Dottie serve the tables just as she had in the old days. Whenever someone asked why such an important woman was still waiting on customers, she would simply smile and answer that she never wanted to forget where she had come from. Her husband would be sitting at the smallest table in the corner, the same table where he had once counted the last few coins in his pocket, quietly watching his wife with the eyes of the richest man in the world. Their story leaves us with lessons that are simple yet profound. That a person's value never lies in the clothes they wear or the money in their pocket, but in the way they treat others when no one is forcing them to be kind. That true love reveals itself only when we have nothing left in our hands except our heart, and that the kindness we plant today, even something as small as a hot cup of coffee offered to a stranger, may become a great blessing tomorrow, because life always finds a way to reward those who keep their hearts honest through hardship. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video with your family and friends, so that every day we may continue listening together to more meaningful and compelling stories. How did this story make you feel, and which detail moved you most deeply? Please share the feelings from the depths of your heart in the comments below. We always look forward to reading every line you choose to share with us. We wish everyone watching this video excellent health, a joyful life, and peaceful, happy days beside the people you love. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.